Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. Proper soil moisture is necessary for healthy plant growth. Do you know how moist your garden soil is right now? Today, you're going to find out the easiest and best ways to determine the moisture level of your soil. How to install a drip irrigation system on a raised garden bed. A raised bed, by the way, has a totally different moisture pattern than your in-ground garden. You'll learn how to pick a soil moisture meter or a soil probe, and how your choice of fertilizers can adversely affect your irrigation efforts. And we talk with a master gardener about how to grow zucchini or summer squash vertically. That's a great solution for the small space gardener. It's all in today's episode 265, Soil Irrigation Basics. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon Jungle in Suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Let's go. It's been a wet winter and a wet spring for much of the western United States, but the fact of the matter is, downpours, heavy rains, atmospheric rivers can happen in just about any portion of the country. And sometimes it's followed by a bout of maybe warmer weather, and you start feeling hot, and you think, oh, my plants are hot, I should give them water. Whoa! Before you do that, let's cover some irrigation basics. What should you do, especially after a wet winter? Farmers are tackling this problem throughout the western United States right now. Home gardeners should be tackling it as well. How do you handle your soil after a full wet winter and early spring? We're talking with Steve Zion, our friend, our organic horticulture educator and longtime organic gardening specialist. Steve, let's cover some irrigation basics here. And I know that the number one answer, of course, is it depends. Because when people say, well, how long should I run my irrigation system? Well, it depends. But I think the first step would be to check your soil moisture before you turn on your sprinklers or your drip irrigation system.
Exactly. And a lot of people, when they check for soil moisture, they look at the surface of the soil. And after one sunny day, that surface of the soil will look bone dry. But you go a quarter of an inch below that in most cases, and the soil can be either moist or even wet. And so the first thing you've got to realize when you're trying to determine the soil's moisture is ignore what the surface looks like. You need to actually dig down into the soil, and there's a specialized tool. There's actually two really, really great tools to help you basically dig into the soil, pull a column of soil out so that you can examine 6, 8, 12, 18, 24 inches, depending upon how long what the tool is called is a soil probe. If it's a 12-inch soil probe, it's basically most often a stainless steel or chrome tube, and about half of it on the side is open and exposed. So you push it into the ground, you pull it out, and you will actually be able to see and touch the soil that's in that tube, and you'll be able to see whether that soil is moist or dry.
Soil probes are nifty tools that every gardener should have. So are soil moisture meters. We'll get into that in a minute or two. But with soil probes, it's shaped like a letter T, so you have a very sturdy handle to hold on to help you plunge it into the soil. And the reason you want to go down 8 inches, 12 inches, that's the root zone of where your plants are growing. Because what we're trying to do here is making sure that the root area, which is the area that absorbs the water, is functioning correctly.
Exactly. You want to know kind of the size of the plant And little tiny plants, young seedlings, when you're just putting them in, the roots might go down a couple of inches. But as those plants grow during the season, if it's an annual, like a vegetable or something, they can go down 12 inches, 18 inches, or, in some cases, if you've got really nice loose soil, 24 or 36 inches. And tree roots go down numerous feet. There's very limited research as to how far the roots go down. I like to water my large shrubs and trees using a drip system for hours to get that water down about 6 feet or more. A lot of people say, well, you're wasting water. Well, if you get the roots down that far, you don't have to water as frequently because you can let the top, 6 inches or 12 inches go dry because the feeding roots are down below.
Yeah, it's all about the roots. It's all about the soil as far as determining where and how long you should water. And all soils are different. You've got heavy clay soils, you have sandy soils. And for those of you who are saying, no way could I push a soil probe down 12 inches in my crappy soil because of hardpan or rocks or whatever, well, there are options available. And the old-fashioned way was to basically hand dig down the root zone, down 8 to 12 inches, grab a handful of the soil that was down at that level, make a ball of it in your hand and squeeze it. If water rolled down your arm, the soil is too wet. If, on the other hand, it fell apart as soon as you opened up your hand, it's too dry. On the other hand, if you squeezed that ball of soil and it broke up with a little bit of effort, that is what is called field capacity moisture, which is the ideal amount for whatever you might be growing.
And what that basically means is you've got different sized pore spaces in your soil. And if you have good soil structure, if you got a healthy soil, you have a diversity of different sized pore spaces. And the large pore spaces allow the water and the air and fertilizer and roots and biology to move through the soil fairly effectively. What's really nice is we got to realize that the life in the soil, which includes our plant roots and the beneficial soil biology and worms and all the other critters that live down there, they need air as much as they need oxygen. And so when you irrigate, and if that soil is saturated, like a lot of the soils were during these atmospheric rivers, the large pore spaces are filled with water. But in time, when we don't have the atmospheric rivers moving through, and typically throughout the year, after you irrigate a short period of time, the water will drain by the force of gravity out of those large pore spaces, so you have air. And that's one of the reasons why you don't want to irrigate too frequently. If you're irrigating too frequently, you're going to always be filling up those large pore spaces with water and depriving the life in the soil of oxygen and air, and you will be encouraging disease organisms.
And that brings up another very good point, too, is after a heavy rain, don't be tromping on your garden's soil because that compacts the soil, which also removes those very necessary air pockets.
Exactly. You want to avoid compaction, and one of the easiest ways to avoid compaction is stay off the soil when it's wet. The easiest way to figure out whether it's too wet or not is to just take a handful of soil, take a hand trowel and dig up a little bit of soil, roll it in your hand, and then drop it onto a hard surface like a piece of concrete or a stepping stone or something like that. And if it just goes splat and flattens like a pancake, then it's too wet. It should, when it hits the ground, it should kind of break apart a little bit.
As opposed to if it's too dry, well, it wouldn't even reach the ground probably in one piece.
Yeah, it would shatter more than crumble.
Now, one reason I like the soil probe is it doesn't require batteries. There's nothing on there really that's going to break. And because you've got that open slot on the side, you plunge that probe into the soil, give it a quarter turn, lift it back out, and then you can examine the soil that has been taken by that probe that you'll see in the side. What should you be looking for? What should you be feeling for in that sample?
Well, when you're talking about irrigation moisture, And one of the nice things is you can pull it out, and again, you can roll it up in a ball and see if it squeezes and moisture comes out. You'll be able to tell. It takes a little bit of time, but for most plants, you want that soil in that probe to be somewhat dry before you irrigate, unless it's a plant that needs moist soil. But for most of our plants, you want that soil to dry out a little bit in between irrigation.
And that brings up the other good point of when is the best time to use a soil probe or a soil moisture meter. And that's before you turn on the drip irrigation system or the sprinklers.
Exactly. And then, a lot of people also ask, not only, when should I irrigate, but how much? And there again, there's that magic word. It depends. Everybody's soil is different, and the environmental conditions are different. And so what I typically tell people to do is run their irrigation system, use the soil probe, make sure that the soil is somewhat dry and needs irrigation. Then run your irrigation system maybe half or maybe even a quarter as long as you normally do. Then you turn it off, wait an hour so that gravity will pull that water down as far as it's going to go. And then you push in that soil probe again and pull it out, and you will actually be able to see and feel how far down that water's gone. And if it's gone down 4 inches and the roots of your plants are going down 12 inches, you've got water 3 times longer.
How many probes do you need to do on a sample size? Let's say it's, 200 square feet. And maybe there's a bit of a slope to it. Do you take that probe and stick it in at the top of the hill or the bottom of the hill, or how do you do it?
Your best off is taking about 10 cores randomly throughout the area. And it's really a good idea to pay attention to what the soil looks like. And more importantly, take some of the soil out of the soil probe and play with it in your hand. And you're going to want to kind of get a feel for what's called the texture of the soil, which is the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. And sand will feel gritty. Silt will feel like flour, and clay, when it is moist, will be slippery. When it's hard or when it's dry, it will feel hard. Pay attention maybe to the amount of organic matter, the color. Typically, the more organic matter that you have in the soil, the darker it will be. And you sometimes will find that the soil on the top of the hill is dramatically different from the bottom of the hill. If you're using raised beds, the soil in one raised bed might be dramatically different from another because the soil that you brought in was brought in from 2 different sources. Where you find that the soils are different, they may need to be irrigated differently.
Yeah, I got a email from a listener who stumbled upon the Farmer Fred Rant blog page, and most of those little newsletters are about 13 years old. And I think in one of them, I was mentioning how I water with drip irrigation in one of my raised beds, one of my original raised beds back in the mid-1990s. And I pointed out that with drip irrigation on a raised bed, you need, as you mentioned earlier, you need to run it for a long time. And I was talking about hours at a time. The one thing I've learned over the years about soil and raised beds, that initial soil that you put in there is going to drain swiftly and in a very small footprint, almost like a cylinder. The more you change the soil by adding compost and mulch, the darker that soil becomes and the richer the soil becomes and the more water holding capacity it has. And I've found over the years, I don't have to run it for as many hours as I used to run it on a raised bed, because you mentioned the nice, rich, black, earthy tone of the soil and the wonderful smell of it. And of course, all the worms working through it. Well, that's what I have now. And I can get away with maybe a couple of hours of irrigation twice a week in the heat of the summer.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it always amazes me when I read, folks' comments in various blogs and on Facebook groups where people say that drip irrigation doesn't work for vegetables or it doesn't work for trees, and because the water doesn't get down deep enough. Well, the only reason the water doesn't get down deep enough is you don't leave it on long enough.
Well, that, and they're putting it in the wrong place. So many people will keep a drip irrigation emitter right next to the trunk. And that's fine when you plant it. But as that plant grows, it's sending roots out. And by putting your drip lines in a concentric circle extending outward from the plant, you're encouraging the roots to go even more outward. So as your plants grow, you need to add on to that drip irrigation system.
And as the tree grows, you have to realize, and this is true with most plants, as the plant grows, there's what's called the drip line. And just assume the foliage is like an umbrella, and then it rains, and the water that falls on that umbrella when it hits the ground is called the drip line. And a lot of people think that that's where the end of the roots are, and that's maybe where you should be irrigating and fertilizing. And that actually is in the middle of the root zone. The root zone actually extends 2 to 3 times beyond that. And so we need to be irrigating and fertilizing and putting compost and worm castings and mulch 2 to 3 times beyond those outermost branches.
Now, I've discovered, too, with drip irrigation lines, the parallel lines that run the length of, say, a 4-foot by 8-foot bed. I remember on my first raised beds, I had 3 lines running, not realizing that it would be a very narrow cylinder of water emitting from each emitter. And it finally dawned on me after much experimentation that you need more parallel lines. So now in raised beds, I will usually run in a 4-foot bed. I will run 5 parallel lines, the length of the bed. So there's maybe 8-9 inches, maybe a little bit more than 9 inches apart from each line. But the footprint of the water is going to be wider because the soil has improved over the years. So you've got that overlapping effect that guarantees that all portions of the raised bed are going to get water.
It's kind of like soil texture. Your soil texture determines when you're applying like irrigation from a drip source, like a drip emitter, where will that water go when that water hits the soil? In a clay soil, it has primarily smaller pores, and the water actually gets sucked into and through the soil. And not only will it get sucked down, but it'll get sucked out. And so when you're talking about your raised bed being improving in quality, it's, you're getting more diversity in the pore spaces, and it will allow the water to move laterally as well as just down. Typically your sandy soils, if you're actually out in the garden, that water is going to, primarily go straight down from your drip emitters. If you're using drip emitters on a clay soil, that's going to spread out pretty far. And so what I generally recommend is if you're like doing a vegetable garden or starting to use drip system, put a line out there, run it for a couple of hours, and then wait an hour and see where that water is going and how far out from this laterally is that water traveling. And the surface, just by looking at it, it's going to look like it's not moving sideways very far at all. You've got to use that soil probe and go down several inches to see whether it's spreading out and how far it's spreading out.
A narrow water cylinder in very sandy soil might only be a few inches wide, maybe 7, 8, maybe 9 inches wide. For a heavy, if that, yeah. For a heavy clay soil, it could be 18 to 20 inches. For a loamy soil, it's somewhere in between that.
Exactly.
I've told you about Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planters. They're sold worldwide. Smart Pots are proudly made 100% right here in the USA. They're BPA-free and lead-free, making them safe for growing vegetables and other edibles. Well, the folks at Smart Pots have added a new product to their lineup, perfect for building the healthiest soil imaginable for your garden by composting. It's the Smart Pot Compost Sack, a large 100-gallon fabric bag that's lightweight yet extremely durable and lasts for years. It can hold 12 cubic feet of pure compost. This rugged fabric is entirely porous, containing many micropores that allow for air circulation and drainage. It's easy to start a compost pile with the Smart Pot Compost Sack. Just open the sack, set it on level ground, and start adding your compostable materials, grass clippings, vegetable peelings, coffee grounds, and more, as well as fallen leaves, straw, and shredded paper. Next, place the optional cover over the sack. That's all there is to it. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers and select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. You can find the location nearest you at their website, and you can buy it online from Smart Pots. Just visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part, because on that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED, F-R-E-D. Do it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots' lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers and their new compost sack. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. It's Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. Let's move on to another thing that people don't consider if they have to live through an atmospheric river. It's not only the timing of when you irrigate your soil, it's also a matter of checking the soil chemistry, because major rain events can also leach soil issues away that you didn't want to begin with, like salinity. If you're in the habit of fertilizing, well, I'll let you, because you have much more fun talking about salinity and fertilizers.
If you're using a synthetic fertilizer, they're really, really high in salts. That is deadly to the soil biology. So when you're using your synthetic fertilizers, it's really harmful to the soil biology. But one of the things where you can get rid of those salts is by heavily irrigating. And so if you're using the synthetic fertilizers and then we have an atmospheric river, it will leach those salts down through the soil profile. For your smaller plants, it will get it out of the root zone. However, for your trees, it may be moving those salts into the root depths of where your tree roots are and causing problems. You've got to realize that a lot of the nutrients and salts move up and down through the soil, primarily down, actually, with your irrigation. They'll move up somewhat with the soil biology as the soil biology moves up and down, in particular the worms. But the nutrients that we have in the surface of the soil before these atmospheric rivers, in addition to the salt, probably have leached down, probably out of to a large extent, out of the root zone for a lot of our vegetables, especially the smaller rooting vegetables. And so we're going to have to supplement with more fertilizer. And as always, I always recommend using only organic fertilizers so that you're not putting down the synthetic fertilizers that are high in salts, that are absolutely deadly to the beneficial soil biology, that works really well in cooperation with the roots to nourish the roots.
Now, it should be pointed out, though, that organic fertilizers do have salt in them as well, but certainly not as much.
That's the big difference. Yeah, all fertilizers contain salts, but the organic fertilizers are comparatively speaking, very, very low in salts. And they're also less water soluble. They're less likely, for the most part, to leach down through the soil. And the organic fertilizers are also in a form that will be able to be digestible by the soil biology, and they will hold on to those nutrients and slowly over time make them available to the plant roots. The water-soluble fertilizers, the synthetic materials, in many cases, especially if you've got a clay soil, you put the fertilizer down, you irrigate it, and because you've already killed the soil biology, your soil has been compacted because there's no soil biology to keep it aerated, and a lot of the water runs off. And with the water-soluble synthetic fertilizers, the fertilizer runs off too. In many cases, it goes across the sidewalk, into the gutter, and directly into our creeks and streams. That is not much of a problem with your organic fertilizers. They will move into the ground, and because they're not as water soluble, they're less likely to travel with the water even if you have runoff, and the soil biology will convert them into forms that the plants can use.
So again, major rain events can alter your soil chemistry, theoretically for the good, but it also may leach away some necessary components, some elements that you may need. And the only way you know for sure is to get a soil test done. Taking a soil sample and sending it off to a firm to get analyzed takes a little bit of work on your part. And I know you've covered this in the past in the many classes you teach about organic gardening. How do you take a soil sample to get it analyzed?
Absolutely critical that you sample it correctly. And what's really sad is a lot of the soil testing services don't explain how to collect the soil. You need to use a stainless steel or chrome tool. The soil probe is really your best bet. And put the soil into a sterile container. I did soil testing for years, and I remember going out and collecting soil samples. And you typically want to take at least 10 cores from the area that you want sampled so that it's a representative sample. If when you're taking the cores and you find, well, this one core, this one little area, the soil is dramatically different from the rest of the soil, don't include that. Leave that separate and know that you're going to have to manage that area a little differently. You want the soil that you're collecting to be all roughly the same and representative of each other. And you need to use this chrome or stainless steel tool because if you touch it with your hands, for example, the oils in your hands will get off into the soil. And when you're talking some of the trace minerals, for example, 3 parts per million can be a deficiency. 8 parts per million can be a toxicity. So just a little tiny bit of contamination can throw those values off, and you won't know that those values are off, and then you will be fertilizing inappropriately. Typically, you also want to, after you've collected the 10 soil cores, you want to basically put it out in the sun and air dry it, or you can also put it in your oven, crack the door open, and turn your oven on as low as it will go, and you want to dry that soil. The reason why you want to dry the soil is because the soil biology will change the properties of the soil in shipment. Basically sterilize the soil without using any chemicals to stop any soil biology from interacting with the soil, so it is a representative sample as to what it was like in the ground. You ship it off and wait for the results. And you should try and find a soil testing service that has experience with making organic recommendations. And that's where it's really hard to find.
We should warn people that when you dry soil in an oven, it's going to stink up the house. So do it when nobody's home.
Yeah.
Or do it outside.
You can do it when you're home.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But yes, when you heat the soil in the oven, there will be a fragrance emanating from that oven, and it may not be pleasant. I personally, I don't think it's horrible, but it's not real pleasant. And you want to use a container. I like what's it called? Pyrex or Corningware works really well.
How deep should these soil cores be taken when you're taking soil samples?
Ideally, the root depth of the plants where you're going to be growing there. Obviously, when you're talking trees, you're not going to take a core down, 4, 5, 6, 12 feet. For most of your plants, I would take at least 8 to 12 inches.
And you bring up a very good point, too, the fact that the sample should be taken in an area where the plants are of the same type. Maybe your vegetable garden for one test, do 10 samples there. If you have an orchard, do 10 samples from the orchard. If you have a forest, 10 samples from that.
Yeah, I mean, if you've been managing the soil differently, don't include the 2 samples where the soil has been sampled differently in the same soil sample. You want to collect soil samples from an area where you've been managing it the same. So if you've been, if you've got a landscape with your normal garden soil, and you've got raised beds where you're growing the vegetables, you've got to sample those separately because the soils are dramatically different.
You mentioned trying to find a company that does organic soil analysis, and you're right, that is difficult to find. I think Peaceful Valley Farm Supply still does that. Do you know if they still do?
Last I knew, they did not, which was really disappointing. And they used to have a booklet available that helped you if you used the same lab that they used. You could basically transfer the information from your soil test and get an organic recommendation just by, the tips that they provide. Last I knew, that booklet is no longer available, which I think is really sad.
And some of these tests, because many of them are doing agricultural samples, some of these tests can be very expensive. Some of the more reasonably priced soil analysis are done at the university level. I know 3 universities that do soil tests for around $20. You get a fairly good report afterwards as far as what's missing and what it needs. Not to the thoroughness that a Steve Zion's soil test would come back with that you used to do many years ago. The UMass Amherst, Colorado State University, and Texas A&M all do soil tests for anybody living anywhere in the United States. I'll have links to those 3 soil testing firms at those universities in today's show notes.
There's a problem with using those university soil tests because they're familiar with the soils back in their area, and their soils are dramatically different than ours. And so when they get a certain result in a soil test, even though we might get the same exact results, the recommendation is going to be dramatically different. You'll get the values, but the recommendations might not be appropriate.
But at least you'd get the values.
Yes.
And those ag tests can easily run over $100. And these tests from UMass, Colorado State, and Texas A&M are, like I say, priced around $20. I'd rather see people get an inexpensive test done than no test done at all.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
All right. So you get the soil test back, and it says, your pH is a little low, or your soil needs nitrogen. Well, duh, whose soil doesn't need nitrogen? And it may mention the percentages of phosphorus and potassium that would be ideal for your soil, things like that. What's a gardener to do?
Well, start with an organic fertilizer. Try and find new fertilizers that have... You in many cases, nurseries sell organic fertilizers that have nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, maybe some calcium, maybe a little bit of sulfur, maybe a little bit of one or two other things. But when we're talking about soils that have been receiving a lot of moisture, and the soils are really, really wet, and they're stressed. The plants are stressed that are growing in them. And so when the plants are stressed, they are incapable or less capable of absorbing nutrients. And so then, in addition to being stressed from the moist soils, now they're being stressed due to a lack of nutrition. And so one of the things you can do is you can take some liquid fertilizers, and again, using only organic materials, and mix them into a spray and spray it on the leaves and spray it even on the trunks of the plants. It's much more effective on the leaves. Try and get the tops and the undersides of the leaves. And it's called foliar feeding. And you can put it in one of those hose end sprayers. It works pretty well. Ideally, I think if you can cover pretty much everything or most of the things that the plants need by using like a liquid fish and a liquid seaweed. The fish provides the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, and the seaweed provides 55 trace minerals, growth hormones. And it's the growth hormones that is particularly important right now when your soil has been really, really wet, because they're stressed. And if they've really been without oxygen, they might be rotting a little bit. And so you want to encourage them with natural growth hormones to encourage new root growth. And the seaweed, both applied as a foliar fertilizer, but more importantly, in this case, watering it into the ground, can be very, very helpful in getting those roots reestablished. In addition to, your standard, organic fertilizers, for tomatoes or citrus or whatever, there are other things that contain, phosphorus or calcium. One nice thing that contains both of those is rock phosphate. It's really good. A lot of people get blossom end rot. And if your soil test comes back that you need calcium, then the rock phosphate will provide you that calcium that you need. That soil test can also tell you various other things that you might need. For example, a good organic source of potassium is green sand. And not all nurseries sell that, but some of your organic suppliers, and some of your better nurseries that carry a lot of organic, fertilizers and soil conditioners will have green sand as well.
Let's talk a little bit about moisture meters that you can find at the garden center, the hardware store. Some of these are rather inexpensive and they may not last very long. Some are very, very good. If you go on to Amazon or one of those sites that sells soil moisture meters, you will find a wide array in a wide variety of prices. I would suggest buying maybe 2 or 3 and seeing how they compare with each other as far as readings go.
Yeah, the more expensive ones are much more reliable. I found that the less expensive ones, they don't really accurately tell you what the soil moisture is for very long. But I also suggest to tell people occasionally put the soil probe in a glass of water or put it in soil that you know to be very, very moist and see if it shows that it's moist. Just put it in a soil that you know is bone dry, and does it say that it's bone dry? Check if you're going to use a soil moisture meter, check to make sure that it's giving you appropriate results, findings.
I think everybody behind their garage or garden, they have a pot of soil that hasn't been used in quite a while. That's probably bone dry. And so you can test it out in that. We learned a lot today, so don't let a lot of rain worry you too much. But again, check your soil before you turn on the sprinklers or the drip irrigation system or pull the hose out and start watering. Just because it's a hot day doesn't mean your roots are hot and sweaty. It's just you. Check it out first. Steve Zion, thanks so much.
It's been fun as always, Fred.
You could have meant it.
I did.
You have a small yard and you think you don't have the room for fruit trees? Well, maybe you better think again, because Dave Wilson Nursery wants to show you how to grow great tasting fruits like peaches, apples, pluots, and nut trees. Plus, they have potted fruits such as blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, boysenberries, figs, grapes, hops, kiwi, olives, and pomegranates. These are all plants that you can grow in small areas. You can even grow many of them in containers on patios as well. It's called backyard orchard culture, and you can get step-by-step information via the Dave Wilson YouTube videos. So where do you find those? Well, just go to davewilson.com, click on the Home Garden tab at the top of the page. Also in that Home Garden tab, you're going to find a link to their fruit and nut harvest chart. You can be picking delicious, healthy fruits from your own yard from May to December here in USDA Zone 9. And something else you're going to find in that Home Garden tab. You're going to find the closest nursery to you that carries Dave Wilson's quality fruit trees, and they're in nurseries from coast to coast. So start the backyard orchard of your dreams at davewilson.com. With the arrival of warmer weather, there are some bloodthirsty pests that are becoming active in your yard and garden. In today's Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast, we talk with a master gardener and a veterinarian about controlling fleas and ticks on your pet, in your garden, and in the house. Plus, they may not be out for blood, but snails and slugs are munching away at your tender young plants. We have tips for choosing the right snail and slug bait so that your dog or small child doesn't end up in the emergency room. The key is choosing the right active ingredients. For current newsletter subscribers, look for the issue entitled Flea and Tick Control Tips. If you're already a subscriber, it's probably in your email right now waiting for you. Or you can start a subscription. It's free. Find the link to the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter in today's show notes or at Substack. And you can sign up at the newsletter link at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. We're getting questions based on a recent episode of the Garden Basics podcast. It was the episode about the top 10 vegetables. Specifically, I think it was number 6, which was summer squash. And we were talking at the time with Master Gardener Gail Pothauer about it. She mentioned one of her favorite squashes and how she grows it on a pallet. And of course, the questions come in. How do you grow a squash on a pallet? How do you do it? Hey, Gail Pothauer's here. We're here at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center on a drizzly May day in California. Go figure. Gail, how do you grow a squash on a pallet?
Well, first off, the variety has to be a bush variety, not one that would trail, 10, 12 feet. So Butterbelly that I grew last year was a bush summer squash. I cut the pallet and I put it on the ground at an angle, kind of a, 45-degree angle or so. And then I used 2 steel T-stakes on the backside to hold them in place so it wouldn't fall over. And I cable tied it. And then I planted my plant at the base of the pallet, and it just grew up it. And there's no twining or anything. It just kind of laid on the pallet and grew up it. So it might have been a little steeper incline than a 45-degree, but at any rate, it's just grew right up it. It was great.
So it didn't sneak through the back, through the spaces on it?
No, I had no issue with that at all. And to say, Butterbelly that I grew wasn't a vining variety, so it's pretty bushy. Yeah, it grew. I'm going to do it again this year.
Well, it certainly makes it easier for harvesting. You can see the fruit a lot easier.
Absolutely, and doesn't have a major footprint, because summer squash can take up quite a bit of real estate in your bed. And so this year I'm already thinking, what am I going to plant on the backside? Because now I have some open space. But yeah, it worked great. Just be sure that you prop up the pallet with something that's pretty sturdy. So I use steel T-stakes. Because the pallet itself is pretty heavy. And then when you get the foliage, you can add some weight to it. But it worked great.
There you go. That's how you vertically grow a summer squash. Gail Pothauer, thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there a way to save water when irrigating fruit trees? In today's flashback episode number 116, Tom Spellman of Dave Wilson Nursery answers with an emphatic yes. You can cut your water use on fruit trees by more than half by following his backyard orchard culture techniques. He tells us how. Also, America's favorite retired college horticulture professor, Debbie Flower, has tips for growing successful citrus trees in containers. Give a listen to one of our most listened to episodes. It's the flashback episode of the week, number 116. It's called Less Water for Fruit Trees and Growing Citrus in Containers. It's from July of 2021. So go to your favorite podcast outlet and do a search for episode 116. You can also find this week's flashback podcast as well as a transcript at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast comes out once a week on Fridays. Plus, the newsletter podcast that comes with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter continues, and that will also be released on Fridays. Both are free, and they're brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. The Garden Basics podcast is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes our homepage, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you can also sign up for the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. That's gardenbasics.net, or you can use the links in today's show notes. And thank you so much for listening.